Labor last night has released its Labor review. It should have been obvious to anyone. Labor should not have had to wait 6 months to find out why they lost the election. And yet, Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen are still resisting the key learnings from the review. It's extraordinary. Chris Bowen gave a speech last night in honour of his idol, Paul Keating, where he spoke about why he thought Labor lost the election. Now remember, this was after the release of Labor's official review, and yet he rejected the concept that any individual policy cost Labor the election. Instead, he said it was the messaging around the fact that there was no narrative tying them all together. And quite extraordinarily, and I think this says a lot about Chris Bowen, and it shows why he will never again have a political career as Treasurer or Prime Minister. And he had ambitions for a long time to be the Prime Minister, because Chris Bowen last night said that it had pretty much nothing to do with Labor's policies, and instead he said it was about populism and global trends. He said that's why Labor lost the election, and he pointed to Brexit and he pointed to the US election. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
What happened on May 18 is a subset of what's happening around the developed world. Donald Trump wasn't meant to win the US presidency, but he won on the support of low-income voters in places like Iowa and Wisconsin, despite Hillary Clinton's policies to help low-income people. Brexit wasn't meant to win in the United Kingdom, but it did, with the support of traditional Labor voters. And despite the closer-than-expected result in Britain in 2017, the Tories actually lifted their share of the working-class vote from 32% to 44%, with British Labor on just 42%, and much of the vote for the independence and Brexit parties coming from former Labor voters. I could go on with examples, but suffice it to say, around the world, left-of-centre parties are struggling to win because people of lower socio-economic status are losing faith with progressive politics to deliver for them.
As for Bill Shorten, the former union boss has been defeated twice now at federal polls. Most opposition leaders don't get more than one shot in the locker, and this bloke has had two. But reading between the lines of the statement he released on Thursday, Shorten still seems to be harbouring future leadership ambitions. It's not just me who thinks that. Paul Kelly said it as well in a piece he wrote in The Australian today. Shorten said he instead intends on sticking around Parliament for the next 20 years. He spoke of what he'd do differently if he had a rerun, and he heaped blame for his loss on the big spending attack ads from the likes of Clive Palmer. Had Shorten won, the victory would have been his, but his loss seems to be everyone else's fault. The polite terminology used in the Labor review was that Shorten's approval ratings were low and compared poorly with Scott Morrison's. But we can be less polite here. We know voters couldn't stand him. And on top of that, Shorten led a shocking campaign that we now know had no strategy written down. That was one of the findings of the review. No campaign strategy written down. Shorten also failed to connect with what Australians want out of life, and that provided an opening for Scott Morrison to step in with its aspirational message. Now, what was the point in commissioning a review into Labor's loss if within just hours of its release, both the would-be Prime Minister and the Treasurer dismissed its findings to protect their own fragile egos? And instead, they seem to want to blame populism, Brexit, global trends, anything but look in the mirror themselves. Now, the review also found that while voters were so worried about the impact of Labor's policies on their own hip pocket, they were given little reassurance from the Labor leaders. The review refers to this attitude that took hold as complacency. We know that this was just pure arrogance. When concerns were raised with Chris Bowen about the impact of various policies like franking credits, he said that if people didn't like the policies, they just shouldn't vote for them. And Shorten, meanwhile, expected victory so much that after Bob Hawke passed away, the review notes that he didn't bother campaigning on the final day of the campaign, while Morrison continued to hit those marginal seats on that day and the following day on polling day. Labor, it was once the party for the worker, and it is now the party for the environmentalist. Environmentalists and the protesters who want to stop the very means by which this worker is able to support his family and livelihood. This is Labor's identity crisis, and it's a point that was expanded on in the review. Labor's caught between its former incarnation of backing the low and middle income worker and blue-collar workers and those who work in the mining industry, and its current incarnation of a progressive party that prioritises the causes of the comfortable above all else. The review talks about it as competing constituencies. If this identity crisis remains unresolved, Labor will struggle to win government. It's only got one choice if it wants to climb out of the opposition trenches. It can support its progressive causes, of course. I mean, Labor is the progressive party after all. But it shouldn't prioritise them at the expense of its core constituency of workers if it ever wants to return to government.